What if I told you that one woman's beauty could bring empires to their knees, and that her death marked the true end of ancient Egypt itself? And what if the story of that woman, Cleopatra, wasn't just one of love and seduction, but of power, betrayal, and the last desperate breath of a 300-year-old dynasty born from the ashes of Alexander the Great's empire? This is the entire history of the Ptolemaic Kingdom, Cleopatra, Nile power, and Rome's last queen. Picture this. The golden sun rises over Alexandria's glittering harbor. Marble statues of gods and kings stand tall beside the Library of Alexandria, where the greatest minds of the ancient world gather. But beneath that brilliance, a storm brews, a royal family tearing itself apart, assassinations whispered behind silken curtains, and the shadow of Rome growing ever closer across the sea. The Ptolemies were not native Egyptians. They were Greek conquerors ruling through charm, violence, and divine illusion. Their dynasty spanned nearly 3 centuries. 3 centuries of incest, intrigue, and incredible ambition. And at its end stood one woman, Cleopatra. But how did it all begin? What kind of empire could birth such a queen? Let's go back to the very beginning. The rise of the Ptolemies. From Alexander's shadow to Egypt's throne, what? If I told you that one woman's beauty could bring empires to their knees, and that her death marked the true end of ancient Egypt itself? And what if the story of that woman, Cleopatra, wasn't just one of love and seduction, but of power, betrayal, and the last desperate breath of a 300-year-old dynasty born from the ashes of Alexander the Great's empire? This is the entire history of the Ptolemaic Kingdom, Cleopatra, Nile power, and Rome's last queen. Picture this. The golden sun rises over Alexandria's glittering harbor. Marble statues of gods and kings stand tall beside the Library of Alexandria, where the greatest minds of the ancient world gather. But beneath that brilliance, a storm brews, a royal family tearing itself apart, assassinations whispered behind silken curtains, and the shadow of Rome growing ever closer across the sea. The Ptolemies were not native Egyptians. They were Greek conquerors ruling through charm, violence, and divine illusion. Their dynasty spanned nearly 3 centuries. 3 centuries of incest, intrigue, and incredible ambition. And at its end stood one woman, Cleopatra. But how did it all begin? What kind of empire could birth such a queen? Let's go back to the very beginning. The story of the Ptolemaic Kingdom begins not with Cleopatra, but with another man whose shadow loomed over the entire ancient world, Alexander the Great. When he died in 323 BCE, the world trembled. At just 32 years old, the man who had conquered from Greece to India was suddenly gone, leaving behind an empire too vast for one ruler and too fragile to survive without him. Imagine the scene. The great conqueror's body lies in Babylon. His generals, once brothers in arms, stand around him, eyes flickering not with grief, but calculation. Who would claim his throne? Who would rule this impossible empire? Among them stood a clever, broad-shouldered Macedonian general named Ptolemy, son of Lagus. Ptolemy had fought beside Alexander for years, shared his victories, endured his madness, and watched him become a god in the eyes of his soldiers. But unlike the others who lusted for glory, Ptolemy wanted something more tangible: stability. When the empire was divided, Ptolemy didn't grab for the biggest slice. He took Egypt, a jewel of the ancient world, wealthy, strategic, and mysterious. The other generals laughed. You want sand and temples? They mocked. But Ptolemy saw what they didn't. Egypt was eternal. Its wealth flowed not from conquest, but from the Nile, a god made of water, flooding each year to renew the land. In 305 BCE, Ptolemy declared himself Ptolemy the Soter, Ptolemy the Savior, founding a dynasty that would last nearly 300 years. Yet Egypt was not easily ruled. The land was ancient, steeped in gods and rituals. For thousands of years, pharaohs had been the living sons of Ra, divine mediators between heaven and earth. How could a Greek outsider, foreign in tongue and custom, ever claim such a title? Ptolemy was no fool. He knew the power of image and illusion. He didn't try to erase Egypt's traditions. He embraced them. He had himself portrayed in the style of the pharaohs, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order. Behind the facade, however, power was purely Greek. Alexandria became his capital, a city of marble palaces, colonnades, and a library that would one day become legendary. Here, Greek philosophers, mathematicians, and poets mingled with Egyptian priests. The result was something unique in history, a fusion of cultures, a kingdom that was both Greek and Egyptian, both ancient and modern. Ptolemy's Egypt wasn't just powerful, it was beautiful. Ships arrived from across the Mediterranean bearing grain, gold, papyrus, and exotic animals. Temples flourished, and deep in the desert, the priest began to whisper that perhaps the gods had truly chosen this new pharaoh. But there was one final act that bound Ptolemy's name to legend. After Alexander's death, his body was being carried to Macedonia for burial. Ptolemy had other plans. He intercepted the funeral procession and brought the corpse to Egypt, entombing it in Alexandria. It was a bold and dangerous move. The body of Alexander was not just a relic, it was a symbol of divine kingship. By claiming it, Ptolemy wasn't merely honoring his old friend. He was declaring himself the true heir of Alexander's legacy. For generations, the tomb of Alexander became a sacred site, visited by kings and emperors, including one Roman general named Julius Caesar centuries later. Standing before Alexander's golden coffin, Ptolemy's descendants would swear oaths of power and remember how their kingdom was born. Yet the glory of the early Ptolemies came at a terrible cost. From the moment Ptolemy I established his rule, his descendants were trapped in a web of their own making. They intermarried, brother to sister, cousin to cousin, to preserve their royal bloodline, mimicking the ancient Egyptian pharaohs. But in doing so, they sealed their fate. Jealousy, paranoia, and murder became royal traditions. Every generation brought new scandals. Kings poisoned by their wives, sisters strangled in the palace, sons killing fathers to seize the throne. The Ptolemaic palace in Alexandria was not merely a court, it was a battlefield of blood and whispers. Despite this, Alexandria thrived. The city became the beating heart of the Mediterranean, a center of science, art, and philosophy unlike anything before or since. The great library of Alexandria rose like a temple of knowledge, housing scrolls from across the known world, over 500,000 works, it said. Scholars like Eratosthenes, who first calculated the circumference of the earth, and Euclid, the father of geometry, walked its halls. The lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guided ships into its harbor, a tower so tall it could be seen for miles. Its flame a symbol of human ambition burning against the endless sea. For a time, it seemed as though the Ptolemies had achieved the impossible. They had fused Greek brilliance with Egyptian eternity. But shadows were growing, both within their family and beyond their borders. By the 2nd century BCE, the Nile's blessings could no longer shield Egypt from the rising power of Rome. The once great Ptolemaic kings had become decadent, their coffers drained by endless wars and excess. The library's scrolls gathered dust while the Senate of Rome devoured the Mediterranean piece by piece. Egypt was no longer the predator, it was becoming the prey, and within the palace walls, civil war was tearing the royal family apart. One generation after another, the throne passed through treachery and bloodshed. By the time Ptolemy XIII, the so-called flute player, took power, the dynasty was a hollow echo of its former greatness. But from that decaying court, one figure would rise who would make the world remember the Ptolemies forever. A young woman, barely a teenager, whose intelligence, charm, and ambition would change the course of history. She would speak 9 languages, command armies, and face the might of Rome itself. Her name was Cleopatra, and her story was only just beginning. Cleopatra's rise. The girl who would be pharaoh. The year was 69 BCE, and the empire that had once been the envy of the world was crumbling from within. Egypt still gleamed under the burning sun, its temples vast, its river alive with trade. But beneath the beauty ran a deep decay. The gods were silent, the nobles greedy, and the royal bloodline, descendants of Alexander's general, was rotting in its own golden cage. Inside the palace of Alexandria, where marble pillars shimmered with candlelight and peacocks strutted through mosaic halls, a child was born who would change everything. Her name was Cleopatra VII Philippata. She was born into danger. Her father, Ptolemy XIII, called Auletes, the flute player king, was weak, corrupt, and desperate. His throne rested not on loyalty, but on Roman gold. He had bribed senators to recognize him as Egypt's ruler, selling Egypt's independence in exchange for his crown. To the people, he was a joke. To Rome, a pawn. But to his youngest daughter, Cleopatra, he was a warning. She saw how quickly power slipped away from the unworthy, how easily kings became puppets, and from her earliest days, she decided she would never let that happen to her. As a girl, Cleopatra studied everything. She learned to speak not only Greek like her ancestors, but Egyptian, the first Ptolemy in centuries to do so. She spoke the language of her people, listened to their priests, and respected their gods. It was more than diplomacy, it was genius. The Egyptian people, who had long despised their Greek rulers as foreigners, began to whisper that maybe this princess was different. Maybe the blood of Isis flowed through her veins. Cleopatra's mind was razor sharp. She studied politics, philosophy, astronomy, and medicine. She could debate with scholars and charm ambassadors in the same breath. Her tutors said she had a voice that could turn iron to silk. Even her enemies later admitted that she had something rare, an ability to make others see her not just as beautiful, but necessary. But the world around her was spinning toward chaos. When her father's greed and dependence on Rome angered the people of Alexandria, they revolted. The flute player fled into exile, leaving behind a kingdom in flames and his daughters in peril. Cleopatra, still a teenager, was forced to watch as her own family tore itself apart in the struggle for the crown. Years later, with Roman help, her father clawed his way back to the throne. His return was soaked in blood. Those who had opposed him were slaughtered, their bodies hung as warnings in the streets. Cleopatra watched this too and learned another brutal truth. Mercy was a weakness rulers could not afford. When her father died in 51 BCE, the world held its breath. In his will, he left Egypt to his eldest surviving children, Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy III, ordering them to rule together as husband and wife. He thought this would ensure stability. He was wrong. Cleopatra was 18, intelligent, confident, and ambitious. Her brother was only 10, a boy easily manipulated by his advisors. The court divided instantly. Powerful men surrounded the young king, whispering that Cleopatra was too independent, too dangerous, too much her father's daughter. Soon her name vanished from official documents. Her image disappeared from coins, and one night the guards came for her. The Queen of Egypt was forced to flee her own kingdom, but Cleopatra was no helpless exile. She escaped across the desert to Syria, where she began to gather mercenaries and allies. She promised them gold, land, and honor. While her brother sat in his palace surrounded by schemers, Cleopatra raised an army to reclaim what was hers. Then fate intervened, in the form of Rome's civil war. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, two titans of the Roman Republic, were tearing the world apart. After losing to Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus, Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping the boy king would protect him. But Ptolemy's advisors saw an opportunity to impress Caesar. They lured Pompey ashore, pretended to welcome him, and then, before his family's eyes, stabbed him to death. His severed head was presented to Caesar as a gift. When Caesar arrived days later and saw what they had done, his face turned to stone. Pompey had once been his ally, his son-in-law, his rival, but above all, he was Roman. To murder him was to defile the dignity of Rome itself. "You have killed a great man," Caesar said, his voice cold, "and by doing so you have condemned yourselves." Cleopatra saw her chance. The Romans now occupied Alexandria, and Caesar was furious with her brother's court. If she could reach Caesar, she might win his favor and her throne. But the palace was guarded, her enemies watching every gate. And so, one night, under the flicker of oil lamps and the silent watch of the Nile, Cleopatra slipped into the city disguised as a servant. Her loyal friend Apollodorus carried her through the streets, wrapped inside a rolled carpet, or some say a linen sack. When Caesar ordered it unrolled before him, the bundle fell open, and out stepped the exiled queen. Imagine the scene. The great Roman general, gray-eyed and battle-hardened, stares at this young woman as she rises before him, calm, unafraid, her gaze steady as the desert sun. She spoke softly, but her words carried the weight of destiny. She told him of betrayal, of injustice, of her right to the throne, and she asked not for pity, but for alliance. By morning, Cleopatra was back in the palace. Her brother's advisors were stunned. In one night, she had turned exile into triumph. Caesar, captivated by her intelligence and charisma, chose her side. War erupted in the streets of Alexandria. The city burned. For 6 long months, Caesar's forces and Cleopatra's loyalists held the royal quarter against her brother's army. Amid the chaos, the great library of Alexandria was caught in the flames, thousands of scrolls lost forever to history. When the fighting finally ended, the Nile claimed another victim. Ptolemy VII, still barely a boy, drowned while fleeing across the river. Cleopatra returned to the throne, triumphant. She was only 21 years old, but now she was more than a queen. She was Egypt itself. The people adored her. The priests crowned her as pharaoh of the 2 lands, and beside her stood Julius Caesar, the conqueror of the world, who saw in her not just beauty, but brilliance. Together they sailed down the Nile, their barge a floating palace of gold and silk. For months they lived like gods reborn, she as Isis, he as Osiris. The people lined the riverbanks to cheer them, and in those moments, Cleopatra must have believed she had done the impossible, united the power of Egypt with the might of Rome. But destiny has a cruel sense of timing. Across the sea, in Rome, the Senate whispered with outrage. They said Caesar had lost his mind, that he was bewitched by a foreign queen. And when Cleopatra bore him a son, Caesarion, she declared him not just her heir, but his. It was a bold move, and it would change everything. Because in Rome, ambition was blood sport, and Caesar's name was already written on 1,000 daggers. Cleopatra and Caesar, love, power, and the fall of Rome's conqueror, the world had never seen a pair like them. Cleopatra, the young queen of the Nile, who ruled through intellect and charm, and Julius Caesar, the master of Rome, who had bent the republic to his will. Together, they were unstoppable, a storm of ambition and destiny that promised to reshape the ancient world. When Cleopatra returned to Egypt with Caesar at her side, her throne was secure for the first time in years. The priests hailed her as divine, the people sang her name, and for a moment it seemed as though the gods themselves smiled upon her reign. But peace in Egypt was fragile. The Roman legions had not come to serve Cleopatra. They had come to watch her. Caesar's power in Rome was growing dangerous, and the Senate trembled under his shadow. He had crossed every line, broken every law, and now he was something Rome had sworn never to accept, a king in all but name. And what did kings always have beside them? Queens. When Caesar left Egypt, Cleopatra followed. She sailed across the Mediterranean, not as a guest but as a sovereign ally. When she arrived in Rome, the people gathered to watch her procession. She came dressed in gold and jewels, her hair braided like a crown, her attendants in silks that shimmered in the sun. They whispered that she smelled of lotus and honey, that her presence made the air itself seem richer. And walking beside her was a small child, her son Caesarion. She claimed he was the son of Julius Caesar, born of a union blessed by the gods. The Romans were shocked. The idea that their greatest general had a foreign queen and an illegitimate heir struck at the heart of Roman pride. But Caesar did not deny it. He gave Cleopatra a villa outside the city and visited her often. For the Romans, it was scandal. For Cleopatra, it was strategy. She knew that every visit, every whisper, every stolen glance was proof that she had the ear of the most powerful man alive. Rome itself was changing. The old republic was dying, its traditions collapsing under Caesar's ambition. Statues of him rose across the city, temples were built in his honor, and people began to speak of him as a living god. Cleopatra understood this better than anyone. She had been raised in a world where rulers claimed divine blood. To her, Caesar's power was not arrogance, it was destiny. Together they could rule not just Egypt and Rome, but the world. But destiny is never kind to those who dream too boldly. In the spring of 44 BCE, Rome buzzed with rumors. The Senate, tired of Caesar's power, began to plot. Even his closest allies grew cold. Cleopatra, sensing danger, begged him to return with her to Alexandria, where the Nile and the gods would protect them. Caesar only smiled. He believed himself untouchable. He was wrong. On the morning of March 15th, the Ides of March, Caesar walked into the Senate house. The men who greeted him were not senators that day. They were executioners. As he took his seat, the first dagger flashed. Then another, and another. The blade struck 23 times. When it was over, Caesar lay dying at the feet of Pompey's statue, the same Pompey who had been murdered years before on Egyptian sands. Cleopatra was still in Rome when the news reached her. The city exploded into chaos. Crowds screamed through the streets. Senators fled. The conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, thought they had saved the Republic. In truth, they had doomed it. Cleopatra, holding her child, realized that everything she had built, the alliance, the security, the dream, had vanished in a pool of blood. She acted fast. Before Caesar's enemies could strike against her, she gathered her servants, her son, and her treasures, and fled the city. Her ship sailed quietly down the Tiber and into the open sea, the Roman sun sinking behind her. By the time the Senate realized she was gone, the Queen of Egypt was already beyond their reach. When she returned to Alexandria, she found herself utterly alone. Caesar was dead, Rome was divided once more, and Egypt, without Roman protection, was vulnerable to its enemies. But Cleopatra refused to surrender to despair. She threw herself into the work of rebuilding. She restored temples, reopened trade routes, and revived Egypt's ancient festivals. Statues of her rose across the land, not as a Greek queen, but as a pharaoh, the living goddess Isis reborn. She ruled with precision and brilliance. Her court became a beacon of wealth and learning once again. Philosophers, scholars, and diplomats came to Alexandria to marvel at the queen who had tamed chaos itself. But even as she rebuilt her kingdom, Cleopatra knew Rome would return. The men who had once served Caesar were now fighting to avenge him, and the Republic was collapsing into yet another civil war. Caesar's assassins fled east, pursued by the men who claimed his legacy, Octavian, his adopted son, and Mark Antony, his most trusted general. For years, Rome drowned in its own blood. But Cleopatra watched carefully. She knew that whoever triumphed in this struggle would soon come for her, and she intended to make sure Egypt would never again bow to anyone. By 41 BCE, one man stood above the rest. Mark Antony, brave, reckless, and charismatic, now shared power over Rome, and he had summoned the Queen of Egypt to meet him in Tarsus. Some said he wanted answers about her loyalty. Others whispered that he wanted to see the woman who had once captured Caesar's heart. Cleopatra prepared not for diplomacy, but for theater. She sailed up the river to meet him on a golden barge, its sails dyed purple, its oars gleaming silver. The deck was covered in rose petals. Incense burned so thick that the wind itself seemed to shimmer. Cleopatra lay beneath a canopy of gold, dressed as Aphrodite, goddess of love. Her servants fanned her with peacock feathers. Her musicians played softly, and her smile was as calm as the Nile. When Antony saw her, he laughed aloud, not out of mockery but wonder. For in that moment, he realized that no rumor could capture her power. Cleopatra was not a woman to be summoned. She was a force to be reckoned with. That night, they dined together, surrounded by gold lamps and laughter. Antony, a soldier hardened by years of war, found himself entranced. Cleopatra spoke to him not as a supplicant, but as an equal. She reminded him of Caesar, of destiny, of the dream that could still unite Rome and Egypt, not through conquest, but through partnership. By the time Antony returned to his camp, he was no longer a Roman general preparing to demand tribute. He was a man in love. Cleopatra had found her next ally, and perhaps her greatest love. Together, they would challenge the might of Rome itself and shake the foundations of history. The fall of Alexandria, war, betrayal, and the death of Antony, the sun blazed over the Mediterranean as the winds of fate turned against Egypt. The year was 31 BCE. On the shores of Greece, two worlds faced each other across the sea. Rome's rising empire under Octavian, cold and cunning, and the last spark of the East, ruled by Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Once, these two lovers had commanded half the known world. Now, they stood alone, their future balanced on the edge of a sword. Antony's heart burned with defiance. But the gods no longer favored him. His army was weary, his fleet restless. His soldiers whispered that Rome had already chosen its master, and it was not him. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, watched the skies and tides, calculating each move like a game of divine chess. She knew Octavian would never forgive them. To him she was not a queen, but a threat. A foreign woman who had bewitched one of Rome's greatest men. He would not rest until Egypt itself bowed to his feet. The Battle of Actium would decide everything. Antony's fleet gathered in the Ionian Sea, gleaming with gold and bronze. Cleopatra's ships were among the grandest ever built, massive, elegant, and richly adorned. Their sails shone like silk under the sun, their prows carved in the shapes of Egyptian gods. But beauty could not win wars. Octavian's admiral Agrippa had outmaneuvered them, cutting off their supply lines and isolating their allies. Hunger and disease spread through the camps. Antony's generals grew restless. Some even defected to the enemy. As dawn broke on September 2nd, the horns of war echoed across the sea. Drums thundered, oars struck the water in rhythm, and the two fleets collided in a storm of fire and steel. Antony commanded the front lines, his voice roaring over the clash. Cleopatra's fleet waited behind, ready to strike when the moment came. For hours, chaos reigned. Arrows flew, ships burned, and men screamed as they drowned in the churning waves. Then, in the midst of the carnage, Cleopatra made a decision that would become legend. Seeing the tide turning against them, she ordered her ships to unfurl their sails and retreat. Her golden barge turned south, away from the battle, toward the safety of Egypt. Antony saw her standard vanish into the distance, and in that single moment, everything he was collapsed. Abandoning his fleet, he leapt into a smaller vessel and followed her, leaving his soldiers leaderless. Behind them, their navy crumbled, consumed by the disciplined might of Rome. It was over. The sea that had once carried Egypt's glory now swallowed it whole. When they reached Alexandria, Cleopatra tried to restore the illusion of power. She dressed in gold, held lavish feasts, and spoke of rebuilding her armies. But everyone knew the truth. The Romans were coming. Antony sat in silence for days, staring at the horizon. Once he had commanded legions that stretched across continents. Now, all he had left was love, and the shame of having lost an empire for it. Cleopatra did not abandon him. She still believed they could find a way, some fragile path between defeat and survival. She sent envoys to Octavian, offering peace, treasure, even her crown, if only Egypt might be spared. Octavian ignored her. He wanted one thing only, Cleopatra herself, brought to Rome in chains, paraded before the crowds as a trophy of conquest. When the Roman legions finally reached Alexandria in 30 BCE, the city was ready for death. Its white marble streets echoed with the sound of marching boots. The people watched from rooftops as their queen's soldiers fought bravely but hopelessly. Antony, though weakened by despair, took up his sword one last time. He rode through the streets shouting to his men, urging them to remember their queen. They followed him like ghosts, driven by loyalty rather than hope. For a brief moment, Antony's courage returned. He led a charge that scattered the Romans from the palace gates, his blade flashing under the sun. But it was too late. Octavian's forces surrounded the city. Then came the message that broke his spirit. A messenger arrived saying Cleopatra was dead. She had taken her own life, they said, rather than be captured. Antony's world collapsed. Without her, there was nothing left to fight for. He called for his servant Eros and ordered him to run him through with a sword. Eros, loyal to the end, could not do it. Instead, he killed himself. Antony, realizing he was alone even in death, took the blade and thrust it into his own chest. The wound was deep, but not mortal. As his blood poured out, a new message came. Cleopatra was alive. The rumor had been false. She was waiting for him in her mausoleum. Antony's body was carried through the city to her. Inside the stone chamber, Cleopatra waited surrounded by treasures, as if already prepared for her own funeral. When she saw him brought in, bleeding and pale, she cried out and tore at her clothes. He smiled faintly, reached for her hand, and whispered something lost to history. Ancient writers say he told her not to grieve, that she must make peace with Caesar. Then, with one last breath, Mark Antony, the Lion of Rome, the lover of Egypt, died in her arms. Outside, the world fell silent. The gods themselves seemed to mourn. Cleopatra held his body and knew that the end had come. There would be no peace with Octavian. There would be no mercy. The Roman general was already marching to claim her palace, her throne, her life. When Octavian entered Alexandria, he found Cleopatra still radiant, still regal, even in defeat. She met him in her mausoleum dressed as a queen, her crown gleaming, her gaze unbroken. She spoke calmly, offering her treasures and her submission, but Octavian's heart was ice. He had already decided her fate. She would be taken to Rome, displayed before the crowds, and humiliated as the final symbol of Egypt's fall. Cleopatra understood at once. That night, she dined with her loyal servants, Iris and Charmian. They dressed her in robes of gold and placed a diadem upon her head. She ordered a small basket of figs to be brought to her chambers. Hidden among the fruit was a small, coiled asp, the sacred serpent of Egypt, symbol of divine royalty and eternal life. Lying on her couch, Cleopatra lifted the snake to her skin. As its fangs pierced her flesh, she neither flinched nor cried. She simply closed her eyes. Her servants followed her into death, and when Octavian's soldiers burst through the doors, they found her lying still, her beauty untouched, a faint smile on her lips. The queen of the Nile was gone. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended forever. Egypt, after 3,000 years of divine kingship, became a province of Rome. Her son, Caesarion, the child she had borne for Caesar, was captured and executed. Octavian, soon to be called Augustus, took her treasures and her throne. The temples fell silent. The gods of Egypt faded into myth. But Cleopatra's story did not die. Across centuries, poets, artists, and historians would speak her name with wonder. Some called her a seductress, others a sorceress, but the truth was far greater. She was the last pharaoh, the last spark of a civilization that had outlived empires. She fought for her people, outwitted her enemies, and chose death over humiliation. In the quiet of her tomb, perhaps she believed that by dying as a goddess, she would live forever. And in a way she did. The Romans conquered her kingdom, but they could never conquer her legend. Cleopatra's legacy, the queen who never died. The winds of Egypt grew still after Cleopatra's death, as though even the Nile itself mourned her passing. The great queen was gone, but her presence lingered like incense in the air. In the days that followed, the Romans claimed her treasures, sealed her tomb, and paraded their victory through the streets of Alexandria. But for all their triumph, they could not silence her memory. Cleopatra's name began to whisper through the ages, transforming from a queen of flesh and blood into a legend, an eternal symbol of love, power, and defiance. Octavian stood before her lifeless body and realized he had destroyed more than a rival. He had extinguished a civilization. Egypt, the land of the pyramids, of Ra and Isis, of kings who ruled as gods, was no longer free. It was now a Roman province, its temples stripped of gold, its priests silenced. The dream of the Ptolemies had ended with a serpent's bite. And yet in that moment of conquest, Octavian could not escape a chilling truth. Cleopatra had won a different kind of immortality. He would be remembered as a ruler. She would be remembered as a legend. As her body was laid to rest beside Antony's, Alexandria wept. The people brought offerings to her tomb, lotus flowers, gold jewelry, and written prayers. They whispered her name as they once had whispered the names of the gods. To them, she was not a defeated queen. She was the last pharaoh who had dared to challenge Rome itself. Her death had sealed the fate of Egypt, but her courage had ensured that her spirit would never fade. Over time, her story spread far beyond the banks of the Nile. Roman poets spoke of her as the temptress who had enslaved great men. To them, she was danger personified, the foreign queen who nearly brought Rome to its knees. But others saw something deeper. They saw a woman who had fought for her people, who had ruled as both intellect and emotion, who had dared to love and to die on her own terms. Cleopatra became the mirror in which every age saw its own reflection. Some saw beauty, others power, others tragedy. As centuries passed, her legend grew. Painters imagined her in gold and jewels, surrounded by marble halls and coiled serpents. Playwrights gave her words that echoed through time. In Shakespeare's verse, she became the embodiment of love itself. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. The real Cleopatra may have died in her 30s, but her image became timeless, reshaped by every generation that tried to understand her. But who was she, truly? History tells us she was a scholar, a ruler, a diplomat. She spoke 9 languages, negotiated with kings and generals, and studied medicine and astronomy. She was more than a beauty. She was a strategist who understood the world's most dangerous game, power. Every move she made, every alliance she formed, was a calculation. When she welcomed Caesar, she secured her throne. When she joined Antony, she tried to preserve her nation's freedom. Even her death was an act of control, denying her enemies the satisfaction of parading her as a prize. Some historians believe she took her life not only out of pride, but as a final message to the world. Egypt might fall, but its queen would never kneel. Her death, like her life, was deliberate, meant to remind the world that sovereignty of spirit cannot be conquered. Rome, for all its might, could never erase her. Even in their own tales, her shadow lingered. Augustus, the man who defeated her, built his empire on the ashes of her kingdom. Yet his triumph was haunted by her memory. The very name Cleopatra became synonymous with allure and intelligence, with the power to command both love and fear. In the centuries that followed, her legacy spread across empires. The Byzantines called her the last great ruler of the ancients. The Arabs, when they came to Egypt, told tales of her as a wise and magical queen. Even in the modern world, her face still stirs wonder. Artists paint her, filmmakers revive her, historians debate her, and the sands of Egypt, eternal and patient, still whisper her name. For though her temples have crumbled and her city sleeps beneath the waves, Cleopatra endures. She lives in every story of a woman who refuses to be silenced, every dream of power won not through force, but through will and brilliance. Her life was not merely a tale of love and death. It was the story of resistance against the unstoppable march of empire. If you listen closely, you can almost hear her voice in the wind that sweeps over the Nile, soft, defiant, eternal. The Queen of the Nile did not die. She simply stepped into legend, and as long as humanity tells stories of ambition and desire, courage and downfall, of empires that rise and fall, Cleopatra will live again and again, forever young, forever wise, forever royal. Because history does not remember her as the woman who lost Egypt. It remembers her as the queen who made the world stop and look toward the Nile one last time before the ancient lights went out. The dynasty ended. The empire fell, but Cleopatra never truly died.